Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the August edition of the CPR CSH Urban Workshop. And today we have Rohit Lahoti with us. Is that how you pronounce your name, Rohit? Last name?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So, uh, Rohit's going to talk to us about measuring perceived tenure security in low-income settlements in India. And it's a methods paper, it's already published, and I'll share a link shortly on it. I've known Rohit for a few years now, has been working in the urban space as a practitioner for some time now with specific interest in housing, especially low income housing, affordable housing, rehousing of slum dwellers in various redevelopment schemes, and is very familiar with the landscape in Maharashtra, especially Mumbai, Thane, and all of those areas. And currently, he is working as a consultant for the Urban Development Department of the Government of Maharashtra. So a lot of his experience is working with the government, and he brings a lot of that to his work as well. So we're really looking forward to this, to hearing you, Rohit. Before I hand this over to him, as you know, you're welcome to either put your questions in the Q&A box for everyone who's here today, or when Rohit is done, and I believe his presentation is about 30 to 35 minutes today, we will bring you to the webinar, and where you can speak and answer your own questions, ask your own questions, so we can have a little bit more interaction. So it's totally up to you whether to type your questions, or to come in. Even if you type your questions, I will be inviting you in and giving you the option of speaking to Rohit yourself. So look forward to the interactions. And right now, I'm handing this over to Rohit. Thank you so much, Rohit, for being here today. And over to you for your speech.
Great. Thanks, Mukta. Thanks a lot. Thanks, CPR CSH, for inviting me. So, yeah, I think I'll just share my screen and then I'll maybe begin. Uh, Mukta, just let me know when you can see it.
We can see it. You'll have to full screen it. Yeah. Yeah,
Is it okay now?
absolutely.
Okay, perfect. Great. Yeah, so thank you, everyone. Yeah, my name is Rohit, and I've been working in the space of urban governance development with a particular interest in housing and land tenure, property rights for some time. And before kind of jumping in directly into what I'm going to present, I would like to kind of give you a brief understanding of how this research interest actually came about. I was basically working, this is a part of my master's dissertation, which I did from Bartlett Development Planning Unit in London in 2019-20, and it was a part of the dissertation, and that's how then it gradually I worked more towards it, and we got converted into a paper. But the story goes actually much before that. Couple of years before my master's, I was working on a qualitative research project, ethnographic research project on understanding the quality of life in Indian informal settlements with University of Chicago Trust, wherein I got an opportunity to work with the head researchers Anup Malani, Adam Shilton, and we were basically one of the key aspects of my work was going on ground in different informal settlements in particularly in Mumbai, Jaipur, and also in Ahmedabad, with a sort of a methodology we had through which we shortlisted some sites, which I'll be talking about in the presentation, and kind of conducting detailed interviews, which were more semi-structured interviews, which cut across housing, services, land tenure, then migration, history, the kind of housing structures they have. Of course, the purpose of that research was very different. It was a collaborative project on understanding the informal settlements from multiple other lenses. But then that experience further sort of shaped my interest towards housing and particularly around land. And of course, when I did my master's, there was another sort of the course was very much focused on the developing world in a global south context, and because of which I got really exposed to different aspects of informality within different contexts across the world, like South American context, Southeast Asian context. And the more and more I started reading about different aspects in, let's say, in Chile, Brazil, the concept of land and the way land issue was solved when it intersected with informal housing was very interesting, which is what made me kind of get into this topic, which I'm going to present to you today. So it's a culmination of different aspects of my experiences, and I would just like to mention like a couple of my mentors without whom this would not be possible is my supervisor Ruth McLeod, who was my dissertation supervisor, and Jeffrey Payne, whose work also, in fact, it's very interesting that I've kind of critiqued his work, but he has been my mentor in shaping this paper. So yeah, it's called like a method to measure perceived tenure security, and why measure is in quotes we'll come to know in the subsequent slides. So yeah, before Mukta, you can see the next slide, just kind of.
Yes, yes,
Okay,
yes.
great. So yeah, like just to lay out the context. So typically, whenever we think about land security or secure property, the easiest way to think about it, how to prove one's tenure security is through showing some agreement, sort of a document, which let's say, which the government, the local government gives. Now, often when it comes to, let's say, middle income, upper income groups, or the more planned settlements where the tenure is very clear, and that kind of makes it much easier for them to prove it in the court of law. But the challenge essentially lies when it comes to urban low income settlements, because often the accessibility is very much contested, because when did they come, at what point did they come, did they have any form of a documentation, some form of a documentation, or was it more like a verbal thing? So the idea is that there are multiple non-recognized forms of land tenure, which are not always de jure as in which are not always legal, which can't be proven legally, and they often remain de facto, or they are often based on certain kind of perception, which is what we are going to tell about. And this non-recognition of different land tenure and property rights often leads to this dualistic way of thinking, like we tend to consider easily that what is formal is legal, and what is informal is illegal or irregular. And often this dualistic notion of looking at the world or looking at informal settlements or any aspect of urban development, I think becomes very problematic, because then we kind of not recognize the whole gray area that exists between, because it's actually much more gray and it is not really black and white. And this often leads to more homogeneous way of tenure formalization, because what this essentially leads to is also the decision in which, the way in which policies are made. Often the policies then are oriented towards giving them some sort of a legal house or or a property document or a title that would kind of uplift them. There is that association that once you give them some form of a documentation or a title deed, they will move towards the upward social mobility, which is not really always true, is what I'm trying to explore here. So then, is land titling the only way for securing a tenure? And is there, what are the other gray areas that lie between? So what the diagram which you see actually in this on the screen, it's what a UN Habitat and had published in 2008, which talks about the continuum or the range of tenure types. Now, what you see, it's like a spectrum, right? Like, so informal land rights and formal land rights, and between these, there are different customary rights, there are anti-eviction rights, there are adverse possession, there's group tenure, collective rights, and the ultimate sort of the way the trajectory moves towards is like a freehold, registered freehold right, which we all of us who are like privileged ones, we always have a registered freehold right, which can be proven easily, which is a document. So before actually jumping in, broadly, just to ensure that we all are on the same sort of understanding, broadly, so de jure tenures, there are different types of tenure security, which we'll be going to explore, particularly on perceived tenure security, perceived tenure security, because that is something which interested me a lot. De jure tenure security often is, of course, what we spoke about. It relies on the presence of titles or documentation, and it conforms to the law. That's the most easiest one. De facto tenure security is essentially which exists in practice, and it can be by lawful authority or not, and it can be something which can be more informal and understood in the sort of a system that is de facto. While perceived tenure security, essentially what I'm trying to delve into in the further work, is a subjective assessment of what are the different kinds of risks which people there perceive, and that also then should be sort of can it and should it be a factor to be considered when thinking about giving security to informal settlements. So what you see on your screen, this has been one of sort of my starting point in this research, which I was trying to understand. And this is basically a notional typology of land tenure and property rights, which my mentor, Jeffrey Payne, had created back in 2003. So what you see essentially here is there are three things, just to kind of orient you. So on the bottom, what you see are different kinds of property rights. So there is a bundle of rights. There is not one kind of property rights. It is much more sort of a to use, the rights to develop, rights to cultivate. So there are different kinds of property rights, what you see on the bottom. Then the tenure category, what you see on the x-axis, there are different kind of categories of tenure also, from right from pavement dweller to owner in authorized unauthorized subdivision till the end. What you see on the rightmost extreme is the freehold, which is the ultimate form of a tenure category. While what you see on the up is the degrees of security, so from low security to high security. And security, as the word itself goes, it's exactly what that means. And what Jeff had tried to do in this is trying to further emphasize on this continuum of how one can feel more secure as one gets a different sort of a tenure category. So kind of cut it short, a pavement dweller has the lowest form of security. I don't know if you can see the gray color. Whereas a freehold, which is the ultimate form of tenure security document, is the highest form of security. So what it essentially tries to build is there is a continuum, and our ultimate aim should be towards freehold. And this is exactly what I'm trying to challenge and come up with a new way to look at these different kinds of tenure categories and how each of this factor can provide a variation in the kind of security which one thinks about. And of course, global land tool network, which is the most significant work which is being done by facilitated by UN Habitat, and that's something I could not delve too much into the paper, but this is something which is sort of a subsequent the next set of work which I'm trying to build on. And this somehow this also kind of has been one of my inspirations also to the way I have approached this research. So what Global Land Tool Network essentially does is it breaks away or rather deconstructs this whole continuum narrative which UN Habitat had done it in 2008, and it has multiple factors which it takes into consideration while deciding land and tenure security, which is of course cultural and contextual sensitivity, because there are different local customs across the world in different aspects of life and different administrative contexts. So that sensitivity needs to be integrated. Then there are community-centric needs, how land tenure should align with socio-cultural and economic needs of local communities which are there in different parts of rural, peri-urban areas as well. And then the continuum of land rights, which we just spoke about, that includes also individual, informal, customary, and group rights. So it is not just about individual rights. Like a lot of tribal areas, the ownership is collective. So can that also should be considered in the way we look at tenure? Then fit for purpose land administration. So there is also need to implement flexible and adaptable approaches, which can be tailored to local conditions. And of course, it has the GLTN also tries to ensure that there is a collaboration among different stakeholders, which come from different sort of levels of uh, governance and also from civil society and equally from private sector. And now, this is a very interesting model which GLTN has tried to, it's a part of it. It's called social tenure domain model. I won't go much in depth of it because you can easily find much more elaborate version of this. But what social tenure domain model is doing, it's a pro-poor land tool. And that has the ability to record various kinds of tenures, which need not always be one which is legally known or recognized. And it captures the evidence on ground, and that tenure arrangements are agreed upon in consultation with the local communities. And that is something which is a very interesting way to then have a non-linear approach towards looking at tenure security. And this is exactly now what I am planning to present to you. What I have tried to do in my research is essentially try to develop a non-linear method to gauge this perception of land and housing tenure security of the urban poor. And once there is a non-linear method, the ability to kind of put it into a box like black and white, legal, illegal, former, informer, probably that can have a much more nuanced and deconstructed way of looking at it, which can essentially guide the decision making of the ones in power and also of the ones who can create an advocacy around it. That is the whole aim. And so now jumping into the way I kind of design my framework. So what I've essentially tried to do, if you can look at the diagram on the right. So there is a the concept of social justice, which I've tried to kind of delve into a lot in terms of the way Nancy Fraser has tried to frame it broadly into redistribution and recognition. Now, essentially, what redistribution means is something which can be distributed, as the word goes, and recognition is something which is more oriented towards de facto or perception based, because often what we are trying to here look at is also that can there be other ways to look at tenure security, and can there what are the other indicators then if it is not just one piece of document. And that's exactly the list of sort of indicators which I've tried to delve upon. So I'll maybe tap into a couple of them. So for example, one of the sort of if you look at number 8, political patronage. Now often lot of these informal settlements in different parts of our cities, you will realize that they are all, it is often linked with the politics prevalent in that particular time and frame when the relocation has happened. And often what this leads to is maybe the local councillor or the local MLA, they might create a certain kind of ensure that there is a certain kind of a vote bank, and they are assured certain kind of security once that person is elected to power. And people believe that there is an exchange of vote and then there is an exchange of security. Now there is a very different sort of a narrative which is built here, because there is a some angle of trust and some sort of a barter which is happening here, which creates a perception of people to live in that particular piece of land, which kind of goes tends towards having some sort of a tenure security, but which can't be legally documented, but it is more verbal. Or for example, if I look at, let's say, number 7, access to basic services. Now, for instance, I would like to hear quote maybe what work which Pani Haq Samiti, the water rights committee in Mumbai by Sitaram Sheller and the team, what they are doing. What essentially they are trying to do is, and the way the whole legal angle through which they approached is that water is a basic human right. And what they have ensured through the art of fighting is that irrespective whether a slum is notified or not notified, or legal or illegal, in whatever definitions that fit into, people have right to water access. And what that eventually did was lot of the settlements who did not have any sort of recognition from the state, even they were provided legal access to water through the BMC. Now, will that be legal or illegal? And that's where the question is then. Because if I don't have certain set of documents, but if I do have certain form of a legal recognition by the local government, then can it be really termed as black and white or legal illegal? So then how can this indicators also need to be considered while measuring this perception, or while measuring this perceived tenure security? And of course, the intensity to which a household feels secure or insecure is also governed by, like we are discussing, political, legal, lot of socio-cultural factors, the location. For example, a settlement which will be like in Jaipur, there is Katputli Nagar right in the midst of the city, which is near the Vidhan Bhavan. And the amount of pressure which that land has from multiple market forces is tremendous as compared to, let's say, a settlement which is more closer to Nahargarh Fort, which is not on such a tenable land, but probably the pressure of redevelopment or taking over by the market is a bit lesser. So then location is also then probably one of the indicators of how people feel about security. So now jumping on to actual cases, so this were like the 3 sites in Mumbai and 3 sites in Jaipur, which we had shortlisted. So my first site, so I'll just go into Mumbai first. So for everyone who's acquainted with the geography of Mumbai, so in the northern part there's Bhandup, then there is Mazgaon, which is in the eastern waterfront edge of eastern Mumbai, and then there is Ambujwadi Malad, which is in the northwestern part. Now, why these 3 sites is also something which is very important to note here. So, essentially, one of the things which was very important was to kind of understand that there is no one concept of slum or informal settlements, because each settlement has different layers to which it has issues. Sometimes it can be for the access of water, sometimes it can be through the illegality of the land. Sometimes it can be also for different issues around access to toilets. So there's a lot of open defecation. So what you see on your screen, so Sarvodaya Nagar in Bhanduk particularly, is, you can say, category A kind of a settlement, which has a lot of assurance. There is a lot of legal access. There's proper access to water. There are toilets. The housing structures are very much robust, as you can see from the photos. So to be very honest, if I actually just take you there, you won't even feel like it should be called as quote unquote slum, but it was notified as a slum in the development plan. Whereas the next, what you see in Kola Bandar, you can see category B, where some structures are definitely more robust, but it is also on the land of central government because it is a port trust land. And because it's not a state government land, there have been a lot of neglect in the settlements which came here around 40 to 50 years ago. And in fact, to the extent that for a long time they did not have a legal access to water, and that's why there was a lot of water mafia which eventually developed there. So there were a lot of these informal systems which became a part of it, while at the same time there was also some sort of a security in the sense that because it's a central government land, so probably the state did not have too much to intervene here, and it was away from the main sort of core city area. While what you see on the bottommost is the community of Ambujwadi in Malad. Now that again is a kind of category C, particularly also because of the kind of housing structure what you see. So they are more like tarpaulin sheets or asbestos roof sheets. So the structures are not very robust. Also because the land is very much contested, people do not have any sort of documentation, so they are always living under the fear of eviction. So broadly, you can see there are different categories of the settlements, which is what I have tried to kind of eventually do more than like around 100 odd interviews in different sites. And also similarly in Jaipur, what you would see. So in Jaipur, there were three sites again, Parvati Colony, Shastri Nagar. Again, this is very close to the fort, and people have pattas here. So pattas are basically what the government gives a individual documentation for your piece of plot. And it can be based on a certain number of years, which has a lease basically. But it is a secure documentation which can be proven in the court of law that it is their property. So this particular colony have patta but then it is also located on a very hilly sort of a region. So of course there are a lot of issues regarding the location in terms of the accessibility, let's say for a water tank. But then there are also a lot of other security which these people have, and that is why they had the confidence to invest in their houses, because that's why the lot of houses here are G+1, G+2 storied, because there was a very lesser fear of eviction for the people who were living here. Whereas in Jawahar Nagar, what you see on the second, uh, the image is the second row, that is basically on the main Delhi Jaipur highway. Again, very prime land, but at the same time, there are also different kind of ownership issues, because just if you go further deeper into the settlement, that's where the forest land begins. Now there is also this land ownership contestation which people go through, and probably because one of the stories which a local would have had told me here was how this road, when it was expanded, so a lot of houses, probably the first set of houses, they were broken down and they had to be relocated somewhere else. So within this Jawaharnagar colony, which is a huge colony actually in Jaipur, there are also different levels of tenurial security which people face or perceive. And the bottommost, again, very similar to Ambujwadi, but still in a very different context in Jaipur, is Gurjar Ki Thadi, which is in the southern part of the city. And probably, I think one of the most sort of like one of the most interesting stories this settlement has had is how lot of times, almost on a very regular basis, they are continuously evicted from here, because there is a lot of private ownership sort of conflict which goes on, because of which people come here, they stay, and maybe probably after a few weeks they are again evicted from here, and then whenever there is a sort of a lull phase, people again come. But at the same time, there is no permanent construction which is done here, which is again very interesting to note when you compare Jawahar Nagar or Parvati Colony with this, because the way security is perceived also determines the way the structure of the housing probably would be visible in such areas. So before actually now jumping towards the way my analysis began, so one of the things, so I had very less time in actually trying to complete my research because I was doing it from the UK, so I did not have too much time to kind of go on ground and do it more like an elaborate work with from a quantitative aspect. So what essentially I tried to do is I tried to give it my own measurement scale. Of course, this is one of the limitations which I will talk about at the end of the presentation. But what essentially you see on your screen is, so if you remember, there were different kind of indicators I was talking about. So like political patronage, access to basic services, location primacy. So on, you see this 10 indicators which essentially govern or influence perceived tenure security. And what I've essentially tried to create like a measuring scale or measurement scale for creating some sort of a visual representation for perceived tenure security. So for instance, if I let's say number 4, location primacy and expected tenability. Now what I'm trying to say here is 1 essentially means that it is less secure or the perceived tenure security is lesser, whereas 5 is high perceived tenure security. So if a settlement is located, let's say in a core part of the city, they will always face the fear of eviction or being taken over by market forces. So the security or the tenurial security is pretty much faring on the low side. Whereas probably if there is some sort of assurance from a local councillor that people here won't be evicted because he is in power, their tenure, perceived tenure security would be much more on the higher level, which would be towards 4 or 5. So that's the spectrum right now I'm trying to deal with.
Did we just lose Rohit?
For each indicator,
Rohit, sorry, we lost you for a bit. If you can just start from the top of the slide again.
perceived tenure security. So Sarvodaya Nagar, right? So the first settlement which we saw in Mumbai, which is of category A. It has good housing, it has a lot of networks, it has good access to services, infrastructure. So the feeling that people would be evicted is very much less. So for example, if you look at, let's say, on the in the diagram, if you look at the bottom left, the access to basic services and infrastructure. Now, because probably it has a lot of access, like it has access to water, toilets, electricity, and the basic roads. So that's why it is faring well. So you can say the more the gray area, the more perceived tenure security which people in those settlements feel. While, for example, in terms of market pressure, now market pressure, what you see, it kind of dips down on the top, on the top left. And the reason for that is because Sarvodaya Nagar is also located in one of the core areas of Bhandu, where it is very much accessible to the railway station, it's accessible to schools, it is accessible to hospitals. Now, because of which there is tremendous market pressure. In fact, I think from my conversation with the residents there, many of them were already going through the process of appointing the developer for redevelopment because a lot of developers were eyeing that piece of land and creating more commercial spaces out of that as well because of the pressure and the connectivity which that place has. So probably that aspect or that indicator fares less in perceived tenure security, how people feel around. So that's why it dips down. So this was basically the way uh, the perception sort of I was trying to visualize it through some sort of an approach which is not really linear, but more towards understanding that how can it be more radial in its approach, where each indicator has a significance and a way to analyze when it comes to a particular settlement or a particular community. And what then I did after that was, so I did that, let's say, for each of these 3 settlements, like Sarvodaya Nagar, Kaula Bandar, and Ambujwadi, which are very 3 different categories of sites and settlements, which we just saw. And then what I did was I overlapped the 3 diagrams. And that kind of created much more interesting sort of conversations around, and also some sort of reflection for me. Now, if you see, for instance, let's say the location. Now, location wise, which we just spoke about, what you see the most better faring is Sarvodaya Nagar. Sorry, the most sort of better faring is a site which kind of focuses, where the focus is not predominantly on, let's say, the market pressure which would be defining it, but more because it is located on a piece of land like Kaula Bandar, which is on a central government land. Now, because it's a central government land, there can't be easily a developer can come and cause a redevelopment, because there are a lot of permission issues and the land ownership conflict which can go on. Or for example, Ambujwadi, if you see, it scores very low on the location tenability as well, because it's on a marshy piece of land where the construction is very difficult, as compared to Sarvodaya Nagar, which is on a prime piece of land. Now, the moment I started overlapping and started going into the nitty-gritties of each indicator, what I realized was how each indicator can sometimes fare well in a settlement, and sometimes that can completely be at a lower sort of a spectrum when it comes to perceived tenure security. So, this assumption that just because a settlement is more robust and in terms of housing structures, it has access to services, so it is the most secure in the city, is not as sort of black and white. Sometimes a settlement which is, maybe probably it has a much more difficult sort of a terrain, but it has, let's say, kacha housing, but it can still be much more secure in terms of market pressure, because probably it is not in the main core city center. So then the security or the tenurial security of the residents living in those sites might be much more as compared to the ones living in the core part of the city. So then essentially what here we are trying to look at is that each indicator will have different reading depending on the contextual and the local conditions of a settlement. And not all slums are same, and not all indicators fare well for one kind of a or multiple kinds of a settlement. Depending on one or two factors, there are multiple factors which create this whole ecosystem of understanding tenure. And then kind of what I jumped into in eventually was also overlapping cities. So for instance, I overlapped Ambujwadi settlement with Gurjar Ki Thadi settlement, which is again a category C in both the cities. And I tried to understand what are the different dynamics which shape them. So for instance, if you see that triangular part, which you can see on the in the center, that is the settlement in Jaipur, Gurjar Ki Thadi. Now, when you look at the market pressure, probably it is very lesser, it fares very less on the market pressure, because it is not in the core part of the city, or probably because also there are a lot of layers within that where the settlement is. There's a lot of land ownership conflict. Whereas in terms of, let's say, political patronage, now what you see, the outer layer, which is the lighter faded one, the faded gray. Now, politically, what you see essentially in Ambujwadi, it fares much more strongly because there are a lot of collectives and there are a lot of individual. There is an NGO which is working there, so people have much more understanding. Especially the youth there are trying to fight for what kind of demands they have. They're going to the court and also trying to get what the community as a whole can demand in terms of their rehabilitation as well. Whereas that maturity or sort of that education in terms of some civil society who is actually helping people in Gurjar Ki Thadi are is little less, because it's also private land. There's also private conflict which is going on. So the formation of collective or solidarity network is much lesser. Now that factor of how solid network that particular community has also creates some sort of a perception, which either people feel secure or they feel partially secure or they feel completely insecure. So understanding these two layers of different cities also brought a very interesting narrative. For instance, one of the biggest narrative, like one of the biggest sort of anecdotes which I remember receiving from someone from the settlement in Jaipur was the demand there from the local government, or the fight there was getting a patta or some sort of ownership on the piece of land, and they were not too much keen on getting infrastructural finance, because people were very sure that once they have some sort of a security on the land on which they are residing, they will be incrementally be able to build the housing or the infrastructure on that. as compared to, let's say, a case in Mumbai where the land comes at huge premium. The demand is more towards getting a house in the piece, getting an apartment in the piece of a building, getting piece of apartment. And this approach towards what is the demand of a particular settlement in a particular city also comes out very strongly when I started overlapping these different settlements in Mumbai versus different settlements in Jaipur, because it also brought a lot of contextual narrative of those city and their history and their growth pattern, how Jaipur is much more radial, whereas Mumbai is very linear, how the demography is very different, how the land prices are very different. So the demands and the way these indicators are also looked at are very different. So, kind of like in the last part of the work, what there are certain limitations which, of course, I have to agree when I was trying to work towards this is when we look at measuring perception or measuring perceived tenure security. Although I did try to create a measurement scale, which was something which which does not have a sort of a legal standing, but then what I was essentially trying to do is not just talk about it, but also show in some form which is not linear, so that the idea is not that people or the fight is always towards having title or document as the ultimate goal. Can there be an incremental approach towards knowing which indicators are important at that point in time, and then kind of using that as a stepping stone to fight for another set of concerns in that particular settlement? And then my question, or rather my conversation with a lot of people at different points, realized that can this be the set of indicators, can that be thought as a checklist, right? So for instance, what I was talking about, what the Water Rights Committee or the Pani Haq Samiti is doing, the moment a settlement gets a legal access to water from Mumbai Municipal Corporation, can that be a stepping stone to now then maybe fight for getting access to toilets? Then can the fight be towards then getting some sort of a registered cooperative housing society? So there can be an incremental way to look at tenure security rather than having an end sort of one way to approach is that need an apartment or need a land title. So can there be much more other layers which probably can make the fight more incremental, which can also help in understanding the complexity of each settlement in different parts of the city, by respecting the local context and then understanding the demands in conversation with the communities who are actually living there. And of course, like not all the indicators can have a conventional scale of low to high, because a lot of it is not measurable in terms of low or high. So that's why there was a couple of indicators which the measuring ability was not possible. And perceptions, again, perceived tenure security, the way I could map this also was because over a period of 2 years, I had a lot of conversations with these people who were living in these 6 settlements with different age groups, with different gender, people from different caste. And based on my conversations and then trying to come up with common understanding, I tried to use that as a way to map it. But having said that, it is not something which is can be homogeneously said that this is what community's perception is. It is, after all, perceptible to people, through which I kind of developed a narrative and through which I tried to kind of give some legibility to tenure security. But of course, the informed decision making would require much more holistic understanding of legal de facto perception, and then coming up with policies which will be more contextual in nature and which won't be just towards a dualistic way of looking at tenure when it comes to informal settlements. And of course, like just because on a scale of 1 to 5 it is high, that does not mean it need not always have a causal relationship, because it will also have to be integrated with what is the time during which it is being done. Because lot of this land or lot of the settlements are always in the continuous fluctuation depending on the changes in the development plan and the changes which are made in terms of, let's say, if there is a new infrastructure which would be coming and passing through that settlement. So then probably there will be other social and infrastructural factors which will take into account when we kind of consider this perceptions. So to kind of have certain sort of conclusion, when I kind of what I derived and what was my sort of an approach to this was that there are two characteristics of these 10 indicators. which are important to identify perceived tenure security in any settlement. One is the intensity of each indicator. So, depending on the context, the local conditions, some indicators can create more security, while those very same indicators can create insecurity in people that they would be evicted. And to each indicator, there has to be an understanding which would be governed by the local conditions and factor in any site. And then the dependency chain within various indicators. So there are a lot of permutations which will happen. For example, the 10 indicators, there might be maybe 3 or 4 indicators in, let's say, in Kola Bandar, whereas there can be 5 to 6 indicators in Dharavi, which will be more important at a primacy level at that point in time, whereas few indicators might not be that important at that point in time, or maybe that those factors or those indicators would have already been taken care of. So there is sort of a contextual approach through which those indicators can be or need to be looked at when it comes to a settlement assessment. And then can there be an incremental step then for enhanced perceived tenure security, which can be towards finding that negotiating ground between state government and central government? Because often, if you look at a continuum versus this versus that sort of a phenomenon, often the way policies are designed, it is much more black and white. But is there an approach where there can be an incremental approach? So, for instance, in Ahmedabad, the slum networking program project, which had happened in Ahmedabad, where a lot of the settlements they got a 10 years no eviction guarantee. And the moment the settlements got a 10-year no eviction guarantee with the basic services like street lights, roads, drainage facilities, etc., people had that assurance that they won't be removed from the place. So they already perceived a better tenurial security, which then they could invest in their housing as their sources of income, as their income grew with time. And there were a lot of interesting factors, which then after 10 years, when it was assessed, a lot of the settlements, it was not this whole idea of slum or this illegality question completely sort of was broken down, because the approach was not towards evicting them, and the approach was also not towards giving them a title, but an approach was towards an incremental way to kind of ensure that people have some sort of a guarantee that they won't be evicted. So can there be such incremental steps towards looking at this informal settlements in our cities? Because each site, each slum site has a different history and has a different trajectory. So then should there be one way of looking at their redevelopment? Can the focus also be towards upgradation, retrofitting? Because not all slum settlements have the problem of toilets. Not every settlement has a problem of water access. So depending on how each community fares on different indicators, can the approach towards retrofitting, upgradation, redevelopment, relocation, can those be more contextual rather than having that one size fits all approach, is also what I'm trying to build on. And that's what brings me to exploring then other alternatives like community land trust, which is very prominent in US, or communal titling, the collective ownership, or the no eviction guarantees, what we were talking about, or for example self redevelopment. So for instance, one of the aspects which lot of middle income housing groups in Mumbai, where the self redevelopment has become a very common phenomenon now, where a cooperative housing society directly takes the loan from the bank and the developer is essentially removed. And what that has actually done in a lot of societies which has been self redeveloped is it has given people a better quality of housing, and at the same time it has created a corpus for them, and at the same time it has created some saleable units through which it gives the housing in a much more lesser price to the new entrants also. But the moment this self redevelopment is spoken in the context of self redevelopment in slum communities or in informal settlements, that's where it becomes very tricky, because banks essentially are not willing to give loans to the cooperative housing society of slum dwellers, essentially because this intent to pay or ability to pay is looked down upon. And of course, the land title is always contested. But probably, maybe, if we look at this tenure security and how that can get some form of a different way to recognize different settlements concerns, can then that lead towards more efficient redevelopment in our informal settlements, where people participate And then there is a local contractor, and there is a cooperative housing society of people, and then there is a local architect who kind of design the scheme. So probably those are more futuristic sort of aspirations. And yeah, Mukta would paste the link on the chat. If anyone is interested to kind of go through the paper at length, please feel to do that. And yeah, I'll take a pause. Thank you.
Thank you, Rohit. So, the link is already in the chat box. I think everyone should be able to see it for the paper, and very happy to take questions. I know Stephanie's already put her hand up, so let me call her in. Yes, Stephanie. Everyone else, if you can just sort of either raise your hands or type your questions in the meanwhile, that would be great.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, thank you very much, Rohit, for a very clear and rich and stimulating presentation. I would like you to elaborate a bit about the next step of the research. I mean, you have already mentioned, the difficulty of really, ascertaining causality links between the various indicators you have mentioned, but still it seems that you have with the 6 slums of which you have spoken, you have 6 case studies. And I was wondering to what extent it seems feasible to really explore in a dynamic way the relationship between the various indicators, because I think that 6, case studies showing us how, various indicators have emerged or not, in the life of these various settlements would really contribute a lot to understanding what kind of strategy work or do not work for going from perceived tenure security to de facto tenure security. Thank you.
Rohit, do you want to answer one by one, or do you want to take a couple of questions together?
Maybe I'll answer one by one because otherwise
Sure.
I'll lose it.
No problem.
Great. Thanks, Stephanie, for those questions. And like, I mean, a lot of those questions are also questions in my mind. So thank you for that. So I think I can answer for now that one of the things which I have been looking into to further kind of go to next level in this work is so the idea of measuring itself is very much contested, right? Because one can't measure so many aspects when it comes to security, because security as a word itself, it's much more elaborate, because within one site there can be multiple forms of security responses also, like way a woman would respond versus a child would respond versus a young person would respond. But then one of the things which I'm thinking in my sort of subsequent sort of work is how can I think about moving towards a list of indicators rather than creating like a measurement. So can there be, let's say, a prescriptive list of indicators which any settlement should be assessed by? And probably once there is that list of indicators where each indicator is thoroughly sort of spoken with a set of people who live there, and then kind of create, maybe there can be some sort of mediating civil society organization. And then this indicators then sort of create out of, let's say, this 10 indicators, there can be maybe three most important significant indicators which really define or can calibrate their next steps towards maybe securing their settlement. And it can be through something as simple as that they decide as a collective that they want legal access to water based on those multiple discussions in this 10 set of indicators. And probably then maybe that the larger idea can be if government or this local body takes maybe 3 4 sites, and then there is a recalibration of how each settlement should have certain checklist or checkpoints which needs to be attained for eventually them to get more no eviction sort of security. So I would say right now I'm just trying to figure a way out to sort of standardize this indicator in consultation and discussion, maybe with a lot of civil society organizations and also with government officials. Because one thing I would say is there is lesser sort of an understanding which I have on this when it comes to how government officials would perceive this, who have this implementing power. So maybe like that is like the immediate sort of a small step for me to further define how this would go further. But
Thanks, Rohit. I was also actually thinking along the lines of how would you actually mobilize this tool and for whom? But I'll let Arkaja come in, and sure she also has some insights which will help you. Arkaja?
Yeah, thanks, Mukta, and thanks, Rohit. In fact, I had the same question about who's going to, how will this tool be used? But I think it's a really interesting piece of work, and I think the answer to how the tool will be used is not obviously a really obvious and straightforward one. But I can think of many ways in which it can be conceptually useful. Okay, so now I have two questions. One is about the changing dynamics of land. So your various indicators, you've acknowledged that the indicators shift and that there is a particular moment in time where a place may be, on each of those scores, a settlement may change. But also that there might be dramatic moments of change, a new program, in the world of people who are looking at ways in which urban land can be aggregated and deployed for infrastructure and kind of formalization of the city. They would see these as breakthrough moments, when they manage to make some kind of policy breakthrough that changes the dynamics from that perspective. But basically what I'm saying is, moments that are, changes, like, and these changes could be regional or like state and city driven. They could be, Mumbai or Maharashtra specific policy moments that could change these dynamics, but also national, to do with land markets and to do with policy and programming, actually. So I'm wondering where you think of or where you might identify the historical evolution of some of these kind of insecurity causing or security bringing kind of indicators. So like a little bit of a looking at this in terms of not just a set of indicators that remains like this, but their relative salience could change. That's one question. And the other was about conceptually, um, in my mind, there is a difference between state recognitions and ownership. And in your indicators, and in fact this is something that it's a I see this in Jeffrey Payne's work as well. That from the perspective of tenure security, the difference between state recognition and ownership doesn't always look the same. When you're, but if you were to contest this, if you were to challenge the, to sort of legally challenge the displacement, then there might be a conceptual difference to be made between claims of private property. So you could have undocumented, but you could be the owner of that land. And you could legitimately, there are, situations where you could quite legitimately be historical owners, traditional owners, or even market-driven owners, but you're owners of that land and there are deficiencies in your documentation of title. And conversely, there could be places where you might have quite a good document of the state recognizing your existence through various forms of state recognition documentation, many of which you've listed. But you don't actually have a claim in ownership. So you have a protection, you have various kinds of protections against eviction, which you might be able to claim on the grounds of kind of human rights and fundamental rights and humanity. And also administrative action of recognizing you and therefore the state binding itself to that recognition, but you can't actually claim it as ownership. And I wanted your thoughts on this.
Great. Thanks, Arkacha. A lot of food for thought. So, yeah, on the changing dynamics of land and the dramatic moments you're talking about. So, I think one of the things which I realize that probably that's also one of the limitations I realize in this work, because there are certain factors which I've considered constant in this piece of work because of the specific sites I'm talking about. While at the same time, and I think I briefly mentioned in my conversation also, like, for example, let's say if we take Samruddhi Mahamarg, what is happening in Mumbai, right? Like, lot of settlements are being, like, there are different highway corridors which are coming up, or the metro. The different settlements for years and years, they have certain dynamics which have shaped them. And suddenly, when a decision is made, automatically they get a notice, like they get a eviction notice or they get a relocation notice. And that kind of completely makes this whole idea of indicator, that few indicators which were faring constantly in a particular pattern suddenly now hold no relevance, right? And I agree with you completely that this sort of regional level changes or city level changes or local changes in fact as well, uh, will be, it is very difficult to account for in terms of understanding tenurial security, because a lot of these decisions when it comes to land, sort of land related concerns are very top down. They are not bottom up, or they are not in consultation, because there is certain sort of a hierarchical approach from revenue department or from urban development department and stuff. So I think maybe probably at this point what I can think of is that can there be a set of indicators which can be more conditional, and can there be certain sort of constant indicators where certain factors would remain probably the same, and there can be certain indicators within that indicators also, can there be certain deconstruction which could be done depending on the potential, like sort of a projection or forecast. So I think like that's something which I can think of right now, maybe to deconstruct this way I'm talking about indicator as one sort of a homogeneous sort of a constant. Maybe that's
Mm.
something which I can think of. I can definitely try to build on. In terms of state recognition versus ownership, yeah, I think that's something which I've thought a lot at different points in time. Also, because, for instance, when this idea of what my sort of two bits on that is, so when there was Urban Land Ceiling Act in 1976, so there was like, there was a direct sort of a questioning that all the private ownership owners of land who own more than 500 square meter needs to kind of submit it, surrender it to the government. But during that very phase, lot of this land was not sort of given back to the government, but then a lot of these private players, they invited people to come and settle there, and that's how there was a prolific rise of slums on private lands, for a major part. And that's why even today almost like majority of the slums in Mumbai are on private lands and not on government lands. So to some extent I feel that this the line is very much blurry, because for instance, if just because they are not evicting, uh, but they are recognizing through ways of the way the political sort of leadership commands. So, for example, one definite example is the Koila Bandar, or a lot of those settlements on the central government land. Now, people don't own that piece of land, but then they have been there for more than 50 years. Now, are they recognized by the state government? Probably not. But then, is there some sort of a mapping which is done when there is, let's say, a central government sort of a survey which is done? Probably central government knows, because these were the very people who were serving the dogs when they came there. So there is that blurriness on who can claim on that private property. But then I feel that ownership need not always, like you said, it need not always have a document, but ownership can also be something which has been built over a time in perceptions. And a collective, or if people are able to kind of claim it without a document, but through some other ways of recognition. And that can be something where there can be, let's say, through, I'm not sure what can be other ways, but then probably some.
Rohit,
Yeah,
just to clarify, so the
yeah.
specific sort of instance,
Hmm.
I mean, the instances you have mapped about these land ceiling lands, actually, I hadn't thought about. I mean, it wasn't on my mind, but yeah, that's a really interesting and complex example also.
Hmm.
But the example I was thinking of was traditional villages that come within the urban boundary. So
Hmm.
in Delhi, we tend to have, people tend to think of those conceptually as different because they say Lal Dora and all. But outside of Delhi and this, Delhi and Punjab area, that Lal Dora is not used as a separate term. Often in Maharashtra, you may be saying Gauthans, but sometimes it's blurry. Something that's classified as a slum, especially in small towns, would really be an old village that has come within the urban area. So in those types of places, people might have uh, full title, but they don't have any kind of documentary evidence of.
Right. So yeah, I mean, when I was actually, I mean, that's something which I've like. I believe you're also talking about this peri-urban sort of areas, right? In the sense where
Well,
bl-
they might be peri-urban at some point and then they become urban,
yeah,
like as the
yeah,
urban boundary changes. But basically, settlements that were older than the urban, than it become being a city.
got it. No, I completely like, I think that's something which I've thought about, but then it's something which the lines have been so blurred in my head when it comes to understanding recognition as a term itself, because as much as I'm advocating as a non-titling approach as the ultimate form, but at the same time, what can be those tangible ways of state recognition
Hmm.
is something which I find very difficult to maybe articulate it to a government officer. Like, if not title always, if there can be other incremental ways of defining recognition or ownership, can there be some mechanism to it? Uh, and that is something that's why maybe probably like I should look into maybe the no eviction guarantee which happened in slum networking project in Ahmedabad. I've not looked into what kind of documents or what kind of proofs which they were given, which made people feel that they won't be evicted. So
I
for
mean, this
like,
is the subject of a longer offline
yeah, I
conversation
know,
that you and I can have with each other.
definitely.
But I don't know if the no eviction guarantee is replicable in the sense of in today's changed administrative context.
Hmm.
A lot has happened between the time when those no eviction guarantees were issued and now. Is it really something that you would consider replicable?
I think it really depends on the tenure, like as in when you say no
I
eviction
think that
guarantee,
Mukta is going to shut us down at
yeah, I
some
know.
point. So I think
No,
we
But
should
no,
it,
have
I'm
this
not. I'm
conversation.
not actually. I was just hoping that more people would jump in. There are lots of people who are probably trying to wrap their head around this. So I don't really want to shut you down, but I do think that I wanted to actually pick up on what Arkaja said about the changed context and come back to Rohit. I when I was listening to you, I was thinking that this could be a great tool for community or
Hmm,
for urban practitioners who are working on behalf of the community, or where the community is sort of stuck in this binary of tenure, non-tenure, title, non-title, for various reasons, because that's the binary that's being thrown at them. Paper dikhao varna nikal jao, paper dikhao varna ghar nahi milega. So that is the reality. And if they are trying to make an argument for themselves, which so the strategy here is to say that we need to walk away from this particular argument of paperwork and build another narrative. And
yeah,
many people in the housing sector have tried to do this in various ways over a period of time. So I see it as another piece of work that contributes to that conversation. But like you yourself articulated, for the state
hmm,
to participate in this conversation and to actually walk away from that binary, the state has to first be prepared to say that we can identify certain settlements where we are not particularly interested in leveraging that land for
hmm,
whatever it is that we want to
yeah,
leverage it for,
yeah,
or where the market we see a certain advantage in protecting the people who live here for whatever reason. So that's a shift that we're not at that point.
right,
That's not where we are, where we have local governments to say first. So we first have to bring people there, and
yes,
then this whole conversation opens up. But
hmm,
if we for a minute presume that there were a local government that says yes, maybe not all informal settlements, but we can
hmm,
identify a set of informal settlements that
yeah,
have been here forever. They could be the kind that Arkaja is pointing to, where there is an element of traditional ownership or community ownership, and there could be political interests in actually not relocating or there is no political intention to actually
yeah,
disrupt those lives.
yeah,
There, I think this kind of an approach
yeah.
could could
No,
open certain
yeah,
ways
I
of
agree.
conversing there. So I do see that as a use. But
Yeah,
I mean, if we start there, and then the conversation has to be that what kind of documentary
hmm,
or state recognition
yeah,
tools or mechanisms can we build in, so that the people are not always battling on the same fronts.
correct.
So
So
this
I,
your framework is great to make that argument. If a community has to make an argument to the
yeah,
state to say that why should we be
yeah,
given documentary or these kind of special recognitions,
correct.
then these are the reasons why we are more secure or whatever it is.
Yeah.
So that's
I,
that's where I
I just
see.
have like one thing to add. Like I completely agree with you, and that's the reason why I thought that probably, um, just adding on to what you're saying, that the way this idea maybe then can be translated more like a measurement tool towards an indicator, a prescriptive set of indicators, which the communities can, maybe it will be easy for them to understand that should their fight be only in a unidirection, right? Can there be certain other ways to look at their own sort of history and their, which then they can take it to the stakeholders. But yeah, in terms of what just the thought which has come to my mind at different points in time is, can there be categorization of different informal settlements depending on their age, depending on their migration pattern, depending on, let's say, the housing structures, depending on the land ownership. So there are different intersectionality, right? Like in terms of every settlement, whereas Dharavi is very different from Ambujwadi, is very different from Kaulabandar. So probably because they are different, how are they different? Can there be legal categorization of different kinds of informal settlements, which then kind of maybe push towards different ways of devising solutions towards each of the category, rather than having one prescriptive set of slum rehabilitation scheme for every slum? That's something which,
We're talking about using the tool of perceived tenure security and your classification of it as a categorization tool, so
can it
that
be
we don't
potentially also lead
paint
to
every field with one.
categorization? Yeah, that's also one of the other use cases I'm thinking of
So
actually.
one of my, one kind of reaction I haven't, I mean, obviously, since I haven't, thought as much about it as you have this particular point that you made right now. But one sort of reaction I might have to it is that it would make things, it might be limiting as well. To make things too transparent and too visible means you can then say, okay, this slum is little old, but we can make land available there because they are relatively newer and their housing stock is a little more scrappy and temporary. So I mean, I don't know how whether this is actually sort of empowering or limiting.
Or in fact, threatening.
Yeah, or in fact threatening.
I mean, there is an ethical consideration that Arkaja is bringing
Yeah,
into.
it might serve well the very well organized older settlements, but it might do the disservice to others that are less well organized.
Hmm. Right. Yeah, I mean, definitely it's more like permutation of different indicators rather than, precisely what I'm also trying to think about, is that should one indicator be given so much emphasis that that becomes the reason for knowing the prescription for their redevelopment, or should there be more complex sort of a discussion and approach towards understanding what are the different things which are actually what defines that settlement, and then coming up with, let's say, three, four ways of looking at redevelopment or rehabilitation or relocation or what upgradation or retrofitting XYZ. So it's more like a permutation of different things, whereas it can be much more difficult if you are just based on the age old versus recent, or prime location versus outskirts. That can be very reductive approach, I agree. So can there be much more, three, four, like, or five, six
Also,
indicators as
centering the kind of human rights and vulnerability
Hmm,
in this,
right,
because this drives it entirely on land and on planning, basically land ownership and planning regulation.
right,
Whereas for the settlements that the settlements that have proper claims of ownership, which are the traditional villages, having a land-based approach might actually be, the most stable, the strongest approach to have, and the strongest kind of legal defense
right,
against threat of eviction. But for everybody else, the principal reason to, the principal sort of motivating rationale is actually, the the lives of the people involved. And
right,
somewhere in our own planning frameworks also, uh, I mean, even tracking the impacts of urban displacement and relocation on people, like basically raising the standard on that is the other direction to go. I mean, it's outside your frame, but I'm saying
hmm,
that's the other direction to go, is raising the, accountability and tracking of. So, you make that, and I mean, like, it's again something that I'm drawing on also from the various legal cases around slum eviction. That aspect of it is, the driving rationale over there.
yeah, yeah,
Whereas
like,
not much has been achieved on, I mean, not so much has been achieved on where people have documentary forms of state recognition. Okay, I'm talking like of, without like a full like exposition of the evidence, but where people have argued based on, tenure, like protection, no eviction guarantee or its equivalents, those pattas that municipalities issue and all, those are useful up to the point where you're actually getting evicted. When you're actually getting evicted, will a court stop your eviction based on a no eviction guarantee? I don't know whether they would necessarily do that.
Right.
Yeah, that has become fraught terrain. We
Yeah.
don't have a
Yeah,
clear.
but whereas a policy which says you have to, like Delhi government had, I mean, okay, and it doesn't work every time, but where you have a policy which has all of the the conditions, you have to do a survey, you have to do this, you have to do that, like there's a whole lot of like protection against arbitrary eviction. Those seem to be something that that's a dimension of it that gets missed out in this matrix.
Mm. Thanks, Arkaja. I'll
Thank you
just
so much.
bring in more folks.
Yes, go ahead. I'll mute myself.
Yes, Mr. Bhatia, if you want
Yes,
to.
yes. I'm Harshad Bhatia.
Yes.
I fully agree with what Ms. Singh has said. I think it makes a lot of sense to really look at it in a different way also, because your title says low income settlements. And I don't think we look at only slums. And slums are not always low income. There's a trade-off. Why does a person live in a slum? It's because he's got the security of a job nearby. And I think when you put indicators from within, you tend to ignore that. So Rohit, I think you need to really look at the aspect of first livelihood and then tenure security. And when we use the word eviction, then tenure security becomes secondary. Just give it a thought. Yeah.
Sure. Thank you.
I just wanted to ask, what did you mean by that? When we use the word eviction, why does tenure security become secondary? I'm just trying to understand.
Yes, because you're moving me from the place. So I'm
Yeah,
out.
eviction is contingent on tenure security, right? I can't, if I have low, just let me complete. If I have low tenure security, essentially, then I can contest my eviction in the first place.
Correct. That's why the Gauthans and the
Yeah.
existing traditional settlements make a lot of sense. When you use low income, they're basically not always low income. They're low income compared to the planned development.
Yeah, of course, of course.
Yeah. So slum is necessarily a condition. Only thing is the devil is in the definitions. The government's definition of a slum doesn't look at it objectively.
Yeah, I think maybe Rohit was trying to get out of using the word slum by using the
Yeah.
word low-income settlement.
Yeah.
So that's the quandary that we find ourselves in, that
Correct,
yes,
correct,
we
yes.
understand, we recognize
Yes.
that slum is a definition.
His approach is excellent. Only thing is, the priority of the indicators will change from place to place, as he has also said that.
Yeah.
And I think that's very important. But what I'm saying is, don't look at indicators only within the settlement. Look at the job security part also. I think it's a trade-off. I really trade off my living quality at home because I have income. That's it.
No, it's a fair point, I think. I mean, if you were to expand this, Rohit, then that would certainly be
Yeah,
something.
my focus right now was predominantly on land and housing.
Mhm.
But yeah, what you're talking about is livelihood, so I can understand that.
No, and also, if you're going to use this framework to talk to government,
Yeah.
then that would
It has-
immediately come
it
into
was
Yes,
important to
yes.
set an
Correct.
overarching framework before I zoom
Correct.
into land and housing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Mr. Bhatia. Are there other folks? Nobody's raised their hand, but I'd be happy to bring others into the discussion. So many people here who have been looking at these issues for a very long time. If any of you want to come in at this point, Partho, Shubhagato, Vinita, I know everyone's listening. Some people have even or are listening while doing other things, perhaps. Priya has left a message for you, Rohit, saying that the presentation is insightful.
Yeah.
So Rohit, just when this the paper that you published, this is your master's work?
Yeah, so it was master's work and it is master's work, and then I kind of further refined it for 3-4 months after master's, and yeah, then it got published. But yeah, then I've been like actually trying to kind of look up now more also into how UN Habitat is approaching this through the global land tool network and social tenure domain model, where precisely the narrative which is being built is how to break away from a continuum or a linear approach.
No, in fact,
And
there was a conference in August last year or September last year, which the IHD had organized. It was an international conference, and there were many delegates from Africa who were actually using exactly
yeah,
those frameworks to look
yes,
at land, because there's a lot of the question of community owned
and customary tenure also. Yeah,
it becomes very, I think so. So a lot of that framework is coming from
yeah,
space like that, which was
definitely.
interesting. But in India, I don't know. I mean, so I know there is a whole literature on travel lands and
Right.
etc. And it may be that those of us who work in the urban spaces are not really engaging with that literature. I don't know. I mean, that's the sense that I'm getting, because I'm
Yeah,
thinking that people who are looking at agricultural land tenures
yeah,
in rural India are actually engaging a lot more with these kind of frameworks than we are, because we are
definitely.
caught in a different slum, non-slum, and a different history of land
Correct.
in
Yeah.
the
So,
context.
and just to add on, like I remember I had spoken to maybe like one or two bureaucrats on this about how to think about titling in or the approach towards tenure. And of course, like the Odisha model is something which which I am not sure how can it be replicated, but definitely it is a big start in the sense that people have some form of security on a piece of land which they have, even if it is non-transferable, I think, and the whole Jaga mission, what is happening on ground. Now, I think when it comes to in Maharashtra, what they are potentially exploring, and I'm not fully sure about the legalities of it yet, they are exploring vertical titling,
Mm.
if not like the patta, because that's patta is impossible in bigger cities like Mumbai and because of the land scarcity. And I think titling in itself, the connotation of titling often is presumed to be of the land and house का agreement होता है types, like so how then kind of title मेरे को मिलना है, मतलब मेरे को क्या जमीन चाहिए types, that itself as a narrative is
Mm.
something which I've realized ki patta as a concept is very prominently known across other cities. Like in Jaipur, people like a lot of this conversations in the settlements which I did, they were not really bothered about a house. They were more bothered about the land on which they are there. Whereas here, the conversation around land doesn't even occur in Mumbai. Rightly so. So then the differentiation in the approach also towards rehousing is then the upgradation or the retrofitting, like exactly what so many like Gautam Bhan and so many others talk about, this retrofitting or recognizing the existing sites rather than evicting or demolishing is sort of again a narrative then wherein tenure security also comes into picture, that if you are recognizing and if government is authorizing that they won't be evicted, then at the same time how are you defining the tenure relation or tenurial security approach officially? It's something like in street vending act also. So what Arkaja was saying, I think was very interesting, that there is that no eviction guarantee till the time the street vendors are provided license as per the act. So if they are not being provided licenses, so they should not be evicted because the state is delaying. So similarly for settlements like this, so wahan pe the act defines it that they cannot be evicted unless the rules and schemes are implemented by the local state governments. But is there something like this for informal settlements then? Right? If XYZ settlement are this many years old, and if there is this kind of houses, and if this is the population XYZ with these conditions, they can't be evicted unless there is a solution which has been prescribed by the government, and it can be rehabilitation, it can be uh, no eviction guarantee, it can be cooperative housing society based or collective based ownership. or something of that sort. So unless that has happened by, let's say, SRA or MHADA or MMRDA or BMC or UDD or Revenue Department, I don't know who will be the defining authority. Till that prescription is finalized at how and where they would be rehabilitated or relocated, they cannot be evicted. I'm like, it's like a larger sort of futuristic sort of a thought in that sense.
No, I mean that's the principle of it. But of course, there are many different intentions and many different categorizations that we make basis which can justify different kinds of outcomes. And that's complicated.
Yeah.
Good. Thank you, Rohit. I think we don't have any more questions, but this is the last call. Anyone wants to throw Rohit question and further complicate his life, you are welcome to do so. Otherwise, we'll wind up. And this is a complex issue, and thank you so much for contributing to it. Many of us here on the Zoom today have grappled with this in our work. Partho, yeah, please come in. I will just unmute, enable your talking. One sec. Yeah.
So I was just wondering, since most of the conversation so far has been around Mumbai and Jaipur, is Rohit sort of, and to some extent, I was just struck by this whole land story between Jaipur and Mumbai that he just outlined. Is it the case that as you go further down the scale, precisely for the reasons that he had earlier mentioned about being in the city center and not in the city center, etc., that the possibility of land becomes much more visible and feasible, and therefore the scope of the demand changes? Is that something that, I mean, is there any sort of even preliminary, anecdotal, any thing that he has looked at in other smaller cities that might sort of lead to that presumption, or is this not really something that?
So thanks Partha for that. So I have also touched upon little bit. I have done my exploration in settlements in Ahmedabad, and Ahmedabad had kind of similar narratives to Jaipur. And probably, I know it's a very simplistic reason, but one of the definite reasons is because those are radial cities. So the pieces of the expanse of the city is much more in terms of the geography. So probably that's why, considering that there is transport network which connects, so people are okay to sort of be a little far if there is a public transport, but then rather have their piece of land in which they can define. Like in Indore, for example, again, not a slum, but then Aranya housing in Indore. So what this whole site and services scheme, where they were given defined sites and then people could build their housing depending on their income levels. So I think as a concept, people having autonomy on what they build on land is sort of more prevalent in places which are where the only or the majority form of development is not buildings or big sort of like skyscrapers or something like that. So probably yes, Mumbai or Bangalore to some extent, maybe Delhi to some extent, Chennai, like metro cities are little case in point here, where the land or the patta wala concept is something which is very difficult to explore because of the premium. But then, yeah, in at least in few small cities which I've been, and tier two cities like in Nasik or Indore or Ahmedabad, and probably like a few other cities which I'm not able to recollect, there I have seen like the demand usually is people wanting a piece of land where they have the autonomy of how and what and when they want to build, as compared to the curbing of what they want in a very different way, where their approach in here is 300 square feet houses or 450 square feet houses. That's the demand as compared to this. So I think that's something which I have been trying to gather in my experience. Yeah.
Does it answer your question, Partho? Sort of.
Sure. Yeah. I'm not, these are all exploration. Housing is hardly going to be something we would be able to fix. But yes, uh, I'm really encouraged by the fact that we're pushing ahead with BLC. So I'm just sort of looking to see what will happen.
Yes, there are some stubborn some stubborn folks who insist on this.
Yeah.
Yes, that is definitely something to be appreciated, to continue to think about these in the face of, a climate which is thinking much
Yeah.
of, formalized housing. So great. Thank you everyone for being here. Rohit, thank you for patiently engaging with all the questions, and I hope the comments help in some way. To everyone who stuck with us, please look at the chat box has a link to Rohit's paper, so you can go in and read it in detail. And look forward to seeing you end of next month for the next workshop. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks,
Muktuk,
everyone.
just as a quick thing, we can also nowadays we can do this, right? In the workshop thing, we can
You can add the
put
link.
the paper link in the show notes kind of stuff, right?
Yes.
We can
We'll
put
do
that
that.
stuff in.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.